So in a medium-sized bowl, add 500 grams of filtered water. You could also use bottled water too. It's both are fine. Just don't use tap water. The chlorine in the tap water will affect the dough or its rise. We're making a gel here, which is basically just mixing water, 120 grams of starter, and around 10 to 11 grams of psyllium fiber. Psyllium fiber, number one, is really good for you, and number two, it prevents leaky dough, which is when the bran in whole wheat flour, it sort of acts like a razor, and it cuts the dough as you stretch and fold it, and then the water leaks out. So the psyllium fiber just acts like a sponge, and it holds the water in, so to mitigate the problem of leaky dough from happening. So just combine all ingredients together in a bowl, mix it with water, and just cover it and let it sit for 30 minutes so the psyllium fiber can hydrate. In another bowl, uh, mix your dry ingredients. 500 grams of flour. I do a split between white flour and whole wheat. I happen to like Anita's whole grain flour. It's relatively inexpensive. You can get it on Amazon. I do a 50-50 split between white flour and whole wheat, and I add you can add anywhere from 19 to 22 grams of salt. Um, Before you add this to the gel, just make sure you thoroughly mix all your dry ingredients. So it's been about 40 minutes. Um, Pre-soaking your gel doesn't. It's not exact. I've left it for 45 minutes. I've done it 20 minutes. I probably wouldn't do it. I probably wouldn't gel it for anything less than 15 and over an hour. But roughly 30 to 40 minutes is good. Just take your dry ingredients and dump everything into your gel. You could use the back of a spoon to mix it, but the problem with that is it takes a lot of energy and it's pretty sore on your arm. I prefer to use a drill personally. For the purpose of the video, I'm doing the dough on the table. It's actually pretty hard to use a drill on table because the bowl moves around, so you could just use a wet towel underneath. Me personally, I always just put the bowl on the ground in between my feet, and then I sit on a chair, and then I can use both hands. It's a lot more comfortable that way. I'm gonna mute the sound of the drill just so I can talk over this. Um, the instructions and the amount of ingredients, 500 grams of water and 500 grams of flour, they're all approximate. when you're making a dough, it's not a science, it's very much an art. So 500 and 500 is just a good starting point. It's going to change the exact amounts required based on the season, based on the temperature and the humidity levels. Now that it's summertime and it's very moist and humid, actually, no, now that it's summer, we have the AC on, so the kitchen's really dry. So the dough is a little bit drier. Once you mix all your ingredients together, if you see a little bit of most of it will come together into a ball, but if you see some flour at the bottom of the bowl, you can either disregard that or you can just throw in a tablespoon or so of water to collect the rest of the flour. In the wintertime, you'll find you'll need a lot more water because it's very dry. So it's just things just to consider. So it's summertime now. I've made this dough in the morning, and it will probably be finished proofing late evening. It's one thing to note that in the wintertime, when the temperatures are really cold and it's really dry, this dough might take 16 to 24 hours to proof. So in the summertime, I'll make it in the morning and have it ready to cook by evening. In the wintertime, I'll make this dough in the afternoon or the evening the day before, and then by the afternoon or the evening the next day, then it'll be ready to bake. So the time and the season definitely is something you need to consider when you're making this dough. I'll leave this at on real time just so you can see the entire process and you can get a sense of how the dough looks and feels. I could fast forward it, but you can't really get to know what the dough looks like. I guess now is a good time to explain or talk about how to keep your sourdough starter alive. A lot of people will say you have to be very specific and it's got to be very sciencey and exact, but in all honesty, the sourdough starter is really just it's water, flour, and bacterial yeast. That's all it really is. Um, you don't have to be too fussy taking care of it. Once I pour my sourdough starter into this recipe, I'll leave maybe about a centimeter or an inch along the bottom of my vessel, and then I'll add equal parts flour and water, and that's it. Mix it thoroughly, saran wrap it, put it back into the fridge. Um, I wouldn't use a jar, like a used jar, only because the lids tend to have exposed rust or maybe some dirt can get in there. Um, I just use a glass cup and I put saran wrap on it. And if you just leave it at the back of your fridge and you feed it once every 7 to 10 days, 2 weeks max, you'll be totally fine. Feeding it is just, you know when you need to feed it is when you look at it and there's this black water on the surface of your starter. That black water is not bad. It's alcohol that the bacteria is created as a result of um, feeding or living or processing all the flour. Just mix that black liquid back into your starter. Discard however much you need so that there's about an inch left at the bottom of your vessel, and then add 50% flour and 50% water, or equal parts flour and equal parts water in any amount uh, to the remaining starter. Mix, saran wrap, and put it back in the fridge. Tip on how to store this bread once you've made it. When it comes out of the oven, let it sit on the counter on a rack uncovered overnight. Um, and the next day, it'll be ready to cut. When you do cut it, it's best to cut it from the center and eat out from the center. Don't cut from one side and work your way to the other side. When you cut from the center, when you take a center slice, you can then store it and minimize any evaporation. You don't want that. You don't want a whole piece of the inside to be exposed. Um, I put it into a bag, loosely covered, on the counter for 3 to 4 days. You don't want to make it airtight because there's a lot of water and moisture in the loaf that you want to evaporate. If you were to put it into the fridge the very next day in a bag or a container, you'll find that there's a lot of moisture building up at the top of your container. So it's good to leave it on your counter for 3 to 4 days, and then after that, when it's appropriately dry, then you can move that to the fridge. If you leave it on the counter for the entire time, it'll develop mold on day anywhere from 5 to 7, which is why I always move it to the fridge on day 3 or 4. Once your dough's come together, prepare a clean bowl and put in a very tiny amount of oil, maybe like 1 or 2 drops, and take a towel and put a thin film of oil all along the edge of this bowl. This will minimize any sticking that the dough will want to do to the bowl and help create a nice crust or a nice skin. Just pat the dough into a rough ball and just take notice of the size or how much of the bowl the dough fills up. We're going to let it proof now, and you'll want to do your first stretch and fold when the dough has risen by 200%. So for this specific bowl that I always use, I know 200% is when the dough fills up that entire cavity. So this is maybe 6 hours later, 7 hours later. It's going to depend. There's no real time. You just got to just watch it, and based on the humidity or the moisture levels, the dough is going to double whenever the dough wants to double. When it does double, then as you see here, I'm just taking a spatula and I'm just gently coaxing the skin or the dough off of the bowl. I'm not really doing much right now. It's very raw. Um, it, it's very firm. It's not very elastic yet, and it's easily tearing. So this is just the first stretch and fold, and you're really just getting the dough off of the bowl. So once you've loosened the dough from the bowl, you'll notice all I'm doing is just grabbing a little bit of the dough from the bottom and just pulling it up. Uh, we're doing this so we can develop a nice hard skin or a nice elastic exterior. There's no real set number of times of doing this. It's one thing to note that we made our gel I made my gel at around 9:30 in the morning, 10. I let it gel for about 45 minutes. I assembled the dough at around 11, and this first stretch and fold now you're seeing is at 7 p.m. I covered it back up, and this is the second stretch and fold that I'm starting. It's been about an hour later, so I think now it's around 8 p.m. So again, you're just loosening the dough from the walls of the bowl, trying not to tear the skin too much. You're going to get a bit of tearing, but you just want to minimize that. Let me fast forward this here because you've already seen it once. And again, you're just developing the skin or the exterior part of the dough. Just sort of twist it into a little ball. And even at the second stretch and fold, it's the dough is a lot more relaxed now. It's not as raw. It has a lot more give to it. It's been about an hour and a half. I think it's around 9 o'clock now or so. And you can really see the volume that this dough is has become. It's very elastic, it's very soft, but it has a lot more shape. It's hard to describe, but it wants to stay together, and it's definitely a lot more mature and a lot more fermented. I'm grabbing the bottom to make sure the bottom's not sticking. And it's the same process that you're familiar with. Just loosen the dough from the bowl and then just grab some of the bottom and just pull it up to the top. And then just sort of twist it in on itself at the top and then wrap it up. So it's another hour later. It's about 10 o'clock right now, nighttime, and you can tell the dough is now at 200% volume. It's filled up the bowl. I'm gently peeling back the saran wrap, and I'm preheating the oven now to 475 degree with the Dutch oven in it, and I'll do one more stretch and fold while the oven preheats. The oven will probably take about anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes to fully get up to temperature. One note about your vessel that you're cooking. Whole wheat dough doesn't have the rise of all white sourdough, and because of that it's important to bake it in a vessel that has the shape that you want. So while all white sourdough can be made and put on a flat surface, it has the elasticity for it to rise into a ball shape. But with this whole wheat sourdough, because this is heavier and doesn't have as much gluten, number one, it's a lot healthier. You need to use a Dutch oven or a Lodge cast iron that has the shape of the final bread that you want to use. I happen to have a 2.2 gallon Le Creuset, but any size would be fine. The 2 gallon cast irons by Lodges are very inexpensive. So here's my last stretch and fold before I put it into the oven to bake. And again, the stretch and folding is just to develop a skin. I've done this bread with no stretch and folds, and it comes out just as fine, just as tasty. You don't get as crunchy of a skin, and you don't really get to know your dough as well. But in a pinch, on many occasions I'll just throw everything together, let it proof for 10 hours or 16 hours. Like wintertime, it might need 16 or 20 hours to proof. Without any stretching and folding, I'll just pop it in the Dutch oven and bake it off, and it's just as good. The stretch and folding is just to develop a nice crust. Put it on parchment, drop it in, put the lid on, and bake it for exactly 55 to 58 minutes. I just pulled it out, and you can see just how nice it turned out. It's got a really good rise, really nice hard crunchy crust, and unlike all white sourdough, it's a very hearty country style of loaf. You can tell it's cooked by, when you knock it, it's hollow sounding, and it's surprisingly easy to do. It took very little effort.